Anchor Protocol, the poster child of what a DeFi savings protocol should look like. You deposit stablecoins, you get paid in stablecoins, and the APY is stable. But where does the yield come from? And that's what we're going to be discussing in this video. So, welcome to Crypto Saver. So, I've noticed on different forums on Reddit people asking, well, I can see that Anchor pays 19.5% APY. But how is that possible? How can that rate be stable unlike so many other projects in DeFi where the APY fluctuates all over the place and most of the time you're being paid in a token that fluctuates so much? And that's what we want to cover here. And we're not just going to be covering the where that APY comes from. We're actually going to divide into two categories. We're going to first look at the depositing side, which is how most people will be using Anchor that watch this video. And we're also going to look at the borrowing side, right? The borrowing side is the one that actually creates the yield for the depositors. So we'll keep it simple at first, and let's look at the depositor side of Anchor. Now, I have Anchor's homepage up on the screen right now. Let's head over to the web app. We're going to let it load, and we are going to go over to the Earn tab. So we can see that currently the APY is at just about 19.5%. And if you've been watching Anchor over the past few months, the rate has kind of stayed there. We did see a little blimp earlier last week where the APY did drop under 19%. It's about 18.5 for an hour or two, but that was quickly fixed. And typically, if you just want to deposit, which we're going to do live very quickly here, let's say we're going to deposit 10 UST, right? And UST is the stable coin for Terra, and 1 UST represents 1 USD. So we're going to deposit that. Let's click on OK here. We're going to post this very quickly. Give it a few more seconds. I just want to show you how everything works on both sides. So it is now complete. So if we refresh the page, we should see under total deposits, we're going to see 10 UST. Now, when you have your UST deposited, you will not be seeing your UST growing. Instead, what ends up happening is after you deposit, if you check your wallet, which by the way, you should connect your wallet to Anchor first if you want to do anything with an Anchor, you will now see that I actually own AUST. Think of AUST as the receipt that you receive in return for depositing UST on Anchor. Now, the way it works on Anchor is that AUST appreciates against UST every 6 minutes. Every 6 minutes, you earn that much more interest. And the way that interest is recorded is by appreciating AUST against UST. So to easier explain that, let's bring up the dashboard screen right now. And we can see that 1 AUST is worth 1.164 UST. If I were to return to this dashboard tomorrow, I would see that 1 AUST is now worth more than 1.164. It might actually be 1.165 at that point. And that's what we mean by AUST appreciates against UST, right? One AUST will always stay 1 AUST in this formula, but the UST side is the one that continuously grows. And that's how that interest is accrued on your deposit. So at some point, if you want to withdraw your interest from Anchor, you would simply hand in your AUST and you would receive more UST than you initially deposited. Now, I've noticed that many people tend to use APY and APR interchangeably within the industry, even though there is a difference between the two. Typically, when you see any sort of yield denoted in APY, that means that yield is derived by auto compounding your interest over the course of that year. So when we see that Anchor says that 19.5% APY, that tells us that interest is already being auto compounded, which it is every 6 minutes. And the reason I mention this is that some people, and we'll bring up a calculator for that, some people might take 19.5 divided by 365, let's say, days, right? And they will see that they would think that they earn about 0.05% interest on a daily basis, but that's not the case. That would be the case if it was a 19.5% APR, but that's not the case when it's actually APY. What the actual rate would be. So just to kind of better explain, what I did a little earlier, I took the APY, and I try to represent it as an APR. So what the actual APR of Anchor is, it's 17.82%. So the right way to do this math, if you kind of wanted to see how much money is growing on a daily basis, at least to get a more accurate figure, you would take 17.82 and divide that by 365%. And you will see in this case, the number is actually 0.048%. Now, if you take that number and let's say multiply against your whole principal, now you're getting a better picture of how much you actually are earning on a daily basis. So now that we briefly covered the depositing side of things, let's head over to the borrow side because that is where we are going to find out where this 19.5% comes from. So let's click on the borrow side. And before we dive into these numbers, let's talk about there's three places that 19.5% APY comes from. The first is the interest collected from those that are borrowing on Anchor. The second is the staking rewards collected from the collateral that borrowers are placing into Anchor to be able to borrow money against. We'll explain that a bit more soon. And the third would be the yield reserve. Now, what I'm going to be doing right now is if we look at the page, we can actually see that I actually have provided some collateral. Now, how did I provide collateral into Anchor? Well, you have two options. You can either provide bonded Luna or bonded ETH. Now, for either example, we'll take bonded Luna. B Luna represents one staked Luna. And the way you would typically convert your Luna into B Luna, you would stake your Luna through Anchor, and in return, you would mint B Luna. And B Luna would represent that staked Luna. Now, if you're holding B Luna in your wallet, you can always go to, I believe, let's see, the bond page. And if you go over to the claim page, you can actually claim rewards. So I have a few B Luna in my wallet right now, and that's having me earn rewards. I currently have about 5 UST in rewards earned. These rewards come from the block rewards you would receive for staking Luna. These aren't just some imaginary rewards just being given to you through some emissions. This is actually a piece of the transaction fees collected on the Terra network. Now, you can provide the same B Luna as collateral on Anchor. And if we head back to the borrow tab here, I've already done that last night. As a matter of fact, in preparation for this video, I provided one B Luna. And again, if you wanted to provide it, you simply click on provide here. You'd enter, let's say, one B Luna, and you'd simply click on proceed. And that is what I did. So after you would do that, you'd end up on this page here. Now let's take in a few things from here. The very first thing we want to pay attention to is the borrow APR. That is the interest rate a borrower would pay to borrow money right now. So right now we can see that it's at a 17.7%. Now we also see what the distribution APR. So what does that mean? Well, Anchor does incentivize people to borrow through their platform by handing you their native token known as ANC. So the math that they're kind of running here, they're basically saying that, hey, if you borrow through us, sure, you'll end up paying a 17.7% APR on the amount of money that you borrowed. But in return for what you borrowed, we'll actually give you ANC tokens. And those ANC tokens at this current price would actually earn you 17.28% in return. And net, the return would be that you would basically pay about half of 1% overall for this loan over the course of 1 year. So that's kind of how they're incentivizing borrowers. Now, so that's the first step as to where that yield is coming from, right? So we have 17.7% is coming from those that are paying for that actual loan. Now, we can see already that I have $90 in collateral value from one B Luna. Well, if we bring up, I'm just going to bring this up, that one B Luna, let's see how much Anchor is actually making from holding on to my B Luna. If we head over to validators here on this website, smartstake.io, we can see that the current block rewards are 8.39%. Now, Anchor is the one that is now collecting those block rewards. Earlier, when I showed you that interest I had collected on my B Luna, that is because that was in my wallet. But the moment I handed that B Luna over to Anchor, Anchor is the one that is now collecting those block rewards. So that 8.39% of APR is now being collected by Anchor, which again adds to their pile of money that they're able to then take and give it over to those that are actually depositing money on the other side of Anchor. So let's play around a little bit with this, with the borrow side feature here. So I have my collateral, but I haven't borrowed anything, right? So let's say I wanted to borrow. I can kind of see that we can take this thing, we can toggle it up, and we can kind of see how they recommend borrowing at about 45% LTV. Basically, easiest way to look at LTV is how much are we borrowing compared to the value of our collateral, right? It's even simpler. Imagine we're providing $100 worth of collateral and we borrowed $50 against it. That would be a 50% LTV. On Anchor, you're recommended to borrow about 45%. Some people could do less. Very rarely do you want to do more. So as you can see, the most you can actually do is 50%. And you would get liquidated if your loan is over 60% of the whole collateral value. But if we do 50%, and the reason why I'm kind of bringing this up, because I kind of want us to dive a bit more into the numbers and actually see how much Anchor would collect from this. So let's say that we are at 75% here. It's a little hard to get there, but we can kind of see the 45% would represent about 40 USD borrowed, right? I'm just going to put this down on my notepad here. So I'm providing about $90 in collateral, and I'm recommended, well, if I wanted, kind of the recommendation here is for me to borrow about 45% against it. So I would borrow about 40 USD against it. So we can do some math here. Bring up a calculator here, and what we are going to do, we're going to take that $40 that we would be borrowing, and we would multiply that against the interest that we would have to be paying as a borrower. And if we do that, we're going to multiply this by 0.177. Oops, 40 times 0.177. And we can see what that number comes out to be, which is 7.08. So if I were to borrow $40, I would pay 7.08 USD in interest for borrowing that amount. We're completely ignoring the fact that we would be receiving A and C rewards there. So this is the money that Anchor would be collecting on this loan. Now, at the same time, we know that I gave them 1B Luna, and that 1B Luna is earning, go back to this page here, is earning 8.39% APR, and that would be on the $90, right? So we can also take that very quickly. Say we take $90, multiply that by 0.0839. So Anchor is now also earning 7.55 from the staking rewards. Okay, so we have $7.08 is collected by Anchor through the actual interest on that USD, and then Anchor is earning an additional $7.55 in USD from staking the collateral that we gave them. Now, if we add up those two numbers, we would see that overall in this whole transaction, over the course of 1 year, Anchor would collect 14.63 cents in interest and in rewards for giving us that $40. Not bad. Now, where would that $40 come from? Obviously, it would come from the depositor side of things, right? Now, this math is pretty simple. If we take 40 USD and we multiply that by 0.195, representing the interest you'd get paid as a depositor, we would see that the depositor would get paid 7.8 USD. So again, if there was a situation where someone deposited 40 USD in Anchor, and Anchor took that 40 USD and lent it out to someone else on the borrowing side, Anchor would have to pay out $7.08 to the depositor, while they collected $14.63 from the borrower. Now, in this example, what would end up happening to that remaining balance? I mean, we can kind of take, so we see this, right? 14.63 would be the amount collected by Anchor from the borrower, and they have to pay out $7.80. So we can see that there's 683 is left over. Well, that money in this example will actually go into the yield reserve. So anytime there's a situation on Anchor where they are collecting more than they are paying out, that goes into the yield reserve. And you can always see the yield reserve by, I believe, going to the dashboard here. So we can see that the yield reserve is currently sitting at just about $70 million. On the flip side, if Anchor is collecting less than it is paying out, it will end up drawing that difference from the yield reserve. So there's kind of this little seesaw balance that can take place. Now, something else that we can do, we can figure out that under these parameters, what is the actual multiple that exists? Like what would, how much borrowed versus how much deposited would it take for there to be perfect equilibrium right now? Well, to get that number, we have to take the amount that's being collected in this example, right? Divided by, in this example, once again, the amount that would be paid to the depositors. And we see that we get a number of 1.87, right? Now, if we head over to the dashboard, we can see that currently there is 2 million UST, I'm sorry, 2 billion UST that is being borrowed and just about 5 billion UST that is deposited. Well, what we can do here, we can take this 2 billion, right? So let's just drop all this here. That should be 2 billion. We can multiply this by this ratio that we just figured out in our example, which is 1.87. And we can see that under the parameters that we just saw in our example, the amount of deposits would have to be at 3.7 billion for Anchor to essentially be equal on both sides, meaning they are, as much as they are collecting, they are paying out just as much, right? That number will be at 3.7 billion. What we can see right now that Anchor is actually, the deposit side is actually at over 5 billion. So that would clearly tell us that, well, they likely have to be dipping into the yield reserve at this moment to be paying out at 19.5%, which they kind of currently are. Now, keep in mind, this ratio is unlikely to be that accurate simply because it does consider a specific variable, which is what the current, how much the LTV, what the LTV is specifically, right? So in our whole example, the one thing we went from was the fact that we were using what was it now again? A 45% LTV, right? So we were basically going over the expectation everyone that currently borrowed had borrowed at a 45% LTV. Now that unlikely is to be true simply because if people borrowed like a month ago, likely the LTV is actually much lower since when it went up in price and so on. But that's kind of a quick example to kind of gauge the health of Anchor is by kind of just looking at the moment and seeing where that ratio typically sits. And it'll still give you a fairly accurate number. Now, during times when Anchor does want to further incentivize the borrowing side, they will lower the borrow APR, right? The actual interest that's being paid on this loan. Now it's at 17.7%. If Anchor sees that they really need to incentivize more borrowing, we can see that borrow APR fall to 16%, 15%, 14%, and so on. On the flip side, if there's too much borrowing going on, they will then raise the interest rates that they are collecting to help reduce the amount of borrowing that is happening. Now, Anchor does intend to release more collaterals over the next couple months. In doing so, it would lead to people being able to borrow against other assets that they might own. I mean, again, typically people want to borrow. The reason why people do want to borrow is because they do not want to sell out of their holdings. So if you are bullish on Luna, you don't necessarily want to sell Luna to to borrow some UST. You could just use it as collateral. Let's say you borrow, right now I can borrow, let's say 40 UST. And if I want to play it safe, I mean, I can go over to Anchor and just deposit it on the earn side and earn a 20% return there, because we can see that right now we would be receiving ANC tokens in return. And I mean, ANC has actually stayed fairly stable price wise. I mean, ever since, I mean, you just from August here, it's kind of stayed in between the 2.5 to $3, even more at around three USD or so. So it stayed, fairly stable even from the very beginning. We did see kind of a drop over the summer, but other than that, it has stayed pretty stable. So this should give you a quick overview on how Anchor really works. So it's just a matter of balancing out the borrower side and the depositor side of things. And naturally, Anchor will be susceptible to market cycles. Like we've kind of seen how usually when there's a bull market and things are really rising, then that's when people want to be borrowing because they want to be risk on. But when things are kind of looking gloomy, people are less likely to be borrowing. On the flip side, we might actually see the exact opposite thing happening on the earn side, where people maybe are less likely to kind of just put their USD within the earn side for 20% if things are really bullish because they think they can get a greater yield elsewhere. Um, but when things kind of crash down, the earn side might actually get more attention from people because people become more afraid altogether and they kind of say to themselves, well, that 20% looks extremely attractive right now. But when that's happening, the borrower side actually is currently hurting. So we are going to have to see how this kind of plays out over the course of the next year. Right now, the system is fairly healthy. I mean, there is a nice chunk within the yield reserve, as we can see at 70 million. So, and if you look at the chart, you can kind of see how the deposit side has been growing as well as the borrower side. So sure, we do see that the deposit side has grown aggressively more than the borrower side. But we also saw that with that ratio of 1.87, we don't need the borrower side to grow at a 1-to-1 ratio of the deposit side, right? If it even grows, let's say for every $2 that's being deposited, $1 is borrowed, Anchor would still run at a slight deficit, but with that amount of yield reserve in existence, it would technically be able to go on for probably years at that point. But it's about getting to that two ratio altogether. And I hope this video was helpful. I hope even for those of you out there that kind of knew a lot more about Anchor, you still kind of found a few nuggets here, kind of better explained how Anchor works as a whole. Now, if you enjoy Terra content, feel free to subscribe. Most of my content, nearly all my content, is about Terra. If you enjoyed this video, appreciate a like. If you have any comments, just leave them in the comments below. I essentially answer all comments. And if you just kind of want to engage in my own little Discord community, I also have Discord. It's completely free. It's going to be in the description. You can always find it there. And other than that, thank you for watching and Happy New Year.